Welcome everyone to the final day of the Global Week. I am introducing our first speaker today, Suruchi Thapar. She is taking a bachelor in social science, philosophy and history in the Center of Study on Women and Gender in University of Warwick in England. Afterwards, she went on to teach for many years the same topics, was awarded a postdoctoral fellowship in the Advanced Cultural Studies Institute of Sweden in Linköping University in 2004. Afterwards, she worked on several projects in Sweden with both the Swedish Integration Board and Council of Science, in collaboration with the University Department's Division of Gender and Medicine Department and Ethics Studies. In April 2010, she joined the University of Uppsala as a senior lecturer. And according to herself, here her main fields are gender discourses of colonization and nationalism, gender violence in India and Europe, ethnicity, social capital and social exclusion, and qualitative feminist research methodologies. All of these led to her book, published first time in 2006, Women in the Indian National Movement, Unseen Faces and Unheard Voices. It was in 2015 reprinted when it was nominated as a Sage Classic. And now she continues to work on important topics as to develop anti-racist strategies in the Swedish healthcare system and how neoliberal health policies and hierarchies of gender, caste, and class and religion in India affects the surrogacy of the Indian women. Last of these topics about the Indian women are which she's here to talk about today, or partly. She's talking about biopolitics of gender violence, dispensability and disposability in the era of global migration. Please welcome Suruchi Thapar.
Well, thank you, Nadia, for that generous introduction, and I would like to also thank Rosa for inviting me, and it has been this has been my first engagement with your university, and it has been extremely exciting and very, very nice. So thanks to all of you for being here. I was just kind of also going to suggest that as I am programmed as a teacher, I also break norms of teaching. So I would like us to have this 2 hours. We can take a short break, as I would in my 2-hour lectures at Uppsala University. But I also want you to interact with me. So I don't want you to be shy. I don't want you to be intimidated. I don't want you to think, oh, if I open or if I say something, that'll be seen as foolish. I just want you to say whatever you feel like. So the topic here is, I'm going to touch upon India. It's a new project that I have started on commercial surrogacy, transnational surrogacy, whereby most of the clients are men and women, white, definitely white men and women from the global north, accessing the bodies of women from the global south. I think migration, of course, is kind of looming as a subject and a worrying subject as to what we all see, both in relation to borders and boundaries, conceptually. But you could say that, you know, the geopolitical environments around us, the economic transformations that we are seeing, together with technological advancements, they have all facilitated or intensified the movement of people across borders and boundaries. So what we could say, arguably, in sociological terms is that the flows of capital and the interconnectivity of people, along with commodity, the flows of not only capital but also flows of commodity and ideas, they have increasingly contributed to this, to this interconnected, globalized world. Having said that, what we are also seeing is different cultures coming in direct juxtaposition with each other, contributing to ethnic diversity, but also this is creating inequalities both at the local and the global levels. Now, something that I would like you to think about is the notion of imagination, that how the movement of people, whether we are looking at within Europe, across Europe, from north to south, how it is related to geographical imaginaries, geographical imaginaries of those who cross the borders. And it evokes often contradictory imaginaries. And that's where I would like to locate, or for us to think about, the often cited debate of the other. These imaginaries that we are talking about has also led to or fed into debates about security and securitization. And of course, they have been framed largely by radical and populist discourses, but also forms of growing nationalism. So this is the context or the framing in which I'm going to place some of the ideas today. And I'm going to start actually the lecture with an anecdote. So the occasion here is the International Political Science Conference in Brisbane, Australia, last year. And I had presented, I had finished my week there, and I was ready to come back to Sweden. And I was sitting in my Airbnb bedsit flat, waiting for the taxi to come. And of course, you know, when you have these extra minutes here and there, sometimes if you don't want to look into your mobile. So I was kind of looking around this empty apartment, pretty much empty apartment, that I saw that there were some kind of magazines lying there. And, you know, they looked like coffee table magazines. And of course, I picked up one of them. And that was the Griffith Review. And the title of the magazine said Hidden Queensland. And because it was kind of placed along with the coffee magazines, I thought that perhaps this was one of the things, when it's talking about Hidden Queensland, it's often referring to places that you should have seen, things that you should have done, all of which, of course, I did not have the time for. But I started browsing through this, and it was actually not a coffee magazine. And I came across an article called Theft in the Name of Science by Paul Turnbull. By the way, if you're interested in reading this, this is also downloadable. You can also write to me. I can send you the link. Now, because of course, now it was very close for the taxi to come, I did not have any other option but to actually just take the pages on my mobile because I was not sure whether I would be able to access this. So I took those pages on my mobile. It was just 4 or 5 pages, and was reading it throughout my journey back. Now, in this article, Theft in the Name of Science by Paul Turnbull, he cites the memoirs of an important person in, you could say, the northern frontiers of Australia. And his name was Cora Halcombe Wills. Now, Cora Halcombe Wills was a butcher. He was a butcher by profession. He was from Dover in England. And his memoirs were only found very recently. He was a white man. And you could say I could say, or you could say very confidently, that he was what is called the frontier perpetrator. perpetrator of atrocities against the Aboriginals in Australia. Now, he also served later on as the mayor of Mackay. Again, you know, we're talking about the frontier provinces in the 19th century, 1876 to 1877. So he was no ordinary man. But maybe perhaps what has been said when he was in his last phases of life, he didn't live for long either. He died at the age of 68. But somehow he came across, or he was overcome by guilt, and he wrote these memoirs, which were locked up in his attic and then discovered fairly recently, in which he writes as a butcher. He says that to get a few specimens of certain limbs and head of a black fellow, which was not a very delicate operation, I can tell you. I shall never forget the time when I first found the subject I intended to anatomize, when my friends were looking on, and I commenced operations dissecting. I went to work business-like, take off the head, then the arms, then the legs, and gathered them together and put them into my pack saddle. And one of my friends, who I'm sure had dispersed more than any other man in the colony, made the remark that if he was offered a fortune, he could not do what I had done. Now, this is directly from Korha Halcombe-Will's memoirs. Now, could one of you tell me what is this quotation reflecting? What do you think he just did in the quotation? I'm sure all of you know the answer, but you're all hesitating and just saying, oh, so the other person is going to start. Now, please, all of you, tell me, some of you, come on. Yeah? He cut up a body. And that was very much, thank you very much for that. And that was an Aboriginal body that he just mutilated, and he's talking about it. Now, what I want you to say is that this was just a memoir. They were systematically doing that in the 19th century, mutilating the bodies, particularly collecting the skulls and the bones, and also what was called the ritually scarified skin. You know, where the Aboriginals had ritually scarred their body. Those skins were very valuable. But besides all that, what was happening in the 19th century was also desecration of graves, where graves were dug up and all these skulls and specimens were taken. Now, where do you think all those... Now, you have to think a little bit about what you have read in the news, what you have heard over the media. Where do you think, we are talking about 19th century, where do you think these specimens, these desecrated graves, these bones and skulls, where do you think we have seen them? Where have they landed, finally? All of you? Or some, yes? Absolutely right. So that's where they have landed. And as you must have been seeing, this has become an ongoing debate whereby museums in UK, museums in Germany, even Queensland National Museum, who had collected these specimens, they have been asked to send the bones back. And you would see increasingly over television, you're seeing more and more Aboriginal voices coming up. So some of them have said the bone collectors, which was Willis, a brutal chapter in Australia's past. Britain pressed to return Aboriginal bones. Aboriginal remains in German museum to be returned to Australia. I.e., they have to be sent back to these communities. And this particular community that Halcombe-Wills was talking about was the Birigubba Aboriginal community that he was talking about. So more and more we are seeing these kind of things about bones sent back. Now you must be thinking that what is it that I'm trying to get at here with this anecdote and with this kind of history about the desecration of aboriginal bodies. The idea here is for me to set in motion the idea of post-colonial continuities, even though the idea of post-colonial still is a difficult term for me. I think it's more problematic than helpful. But let's say, for namesake, just let's use the idea of post-colonial continuities and then think for an alternative. Now, have you all heard of the Peruvian sociologist Aníbal Quijano? You have? Some of you are nodding. Okay, for those of you who haven't heard about Aníbal Quijano, you know, he was a Peruvian sociologist who introduced the idea of the coloniality of power, quote unquote coloniality. And Quijano was one of the theorists who highlighted the centrality of race, which was very important to understand these Euro-centered world power structures, which are very important in this age of gender and globalization. And Quijano was very, very clear. He said that the invention of race, or the invention of race, right? So here we are not taking race as a given category, but we are talking about it as an invention. So he was very clear in saying that the invention of race has given way to new social identities. And these new social identities is something that we are grappling with in the age of globalization. So how did this invention of race take place? So first, we were looking into what he calls the physiognomic traits. So we are looking at external manifestations of the racial nature. Is he white? Is he Indian? Is he a Negro? Is he yellow? Is he olive? These are the physiognomic traits that we look at before we are inventing race. And of course, then this was given, this was replaced more with geocultural identities, such as European, American, African. This is how what Quijano talks about the invention of race. So Quijano's work, I would encourage you to look at in terms of the coloniality of power, is to understand how coloniality is one axis of this Eurocentric or Euro-centered global capitalism. Then modernity is the other axis. Are you all with me? Are you all following me? So we are looking at one axis of coloniality, one axis, and modernity as the other axis. So how do we connect these? And Quijano pretty much argues that we have moved from an era of global colonialism, which was where we could embed Will's story, to a current phase of global coloniality. So I'm very troubled with the idea of globalization, because I think that we need to problematize the idea of globalization. And maybe we need to think, if we need to understand the power structures in the global world, then perhaps globalization is not the adequate term to understand. What we need to be thinking about more is in terms of global coloniality or coloniality of power. That is just an idea. That is not to impose my suggestions on top of you. Because coloniality, as it has been argued by political sociologists, is an underside of modernity. So we can't look at them one. And that is the troubling idea about post-colonialism. One embedded in the historical phase and one in the global age. No, they are both the two sides of the same coin. So what we have to see is that our current global situation is where the imperial colonial relations have brought both imperialism and capitalism together. So Quijano's famous phrase then is that coloniality is constitutive of modernity. And I want you to think a little bit just about this in terms of globalization. Now, Quijano was criticized also for his work by people like feminists, Latin American feminists like Maria Lugones. All of you familiar with Maria Lugones' work? Yes or no? Okay, no problem. And Lugones was a response to Cujano, and said that, well, gender, he's gender blind, and that was a right critique. Cujano never revolted against that. He was gender blind, but yet a very seminal contribution. And Lugones said that gender is very important to see, both constituted by and constituting the coloniality of power. And here also, this comes the problematization of gender. Now, of course, we are very familiar with what, when we were undergraduates and we were doing our PhDs, we were all kind of familiar about the social construction of gender. Then we made it a little bit more sophisticated with thinking about it in terms of masculinity and femininity. And then, of course, we were sort of using ideas such as gender systems, gender regimes. But think about it, I also want you to think about how Lugones uses this, that why do we need to talk about gender? And this is something that we have to think and relate it with coloniality of power. That was gender also a colonial construct, something that we use and employ so freely and have problematized as well. So Lugones' argument is that gender was never an organizing principle for certain societies, for Latin American societies. It was an imposition by the colonial modern European system on these societies. So, in other words, in a nutshell, gender was introduced by Western colonizers, and it became a tool for domination, whereby women came to be defined in relation to men. Yeah? Are you all with me, or shall I clarify? You must tell me when there's something not clear, just tell me and I'll repeat it or I'll rephrase it in different. Are you all with me? So if gender was a colonial imposition, then why are we talking about gender now? That means we are also kind of taking the colonial language to understand our day-to-day reality, to understand global processes. Okay? So Lugones then says that as soon as you entered, as soon as you had gender, which was an imposition, because she said that a majority of these non-Europeans that she's talking about, they turned into subhumans when gender was brought in, because there was no gender. So the Europeans said that if you don't have gender, if you don't have an organizing principle, then you people are subhumans. Because gender was an organizing principle very much for these enlightened Europeans, where the woman was the hearth maker, the homemaker, and the man was the public figure. You're all familiar with these debates, yeah? So this imposition on non-European societies, of course, made them think that they were not like us. They were not the enlightened, rational European white man. They were the subhumans who had to be tamed and controlled. So the idea of racial inferiorization, the racial inferiority and gender subordination all set in. And what was it replacing? It was replacing pretty much a gynocratic, or you could say an egalitarian spiritual plurality, which were the non-Europeans were interested in at that time. Okay? It was replacing those with patriarchal and hierarchical structures. Yeah. So you could say that there was no conceptualizations, that the conceptualizations of sex and gender in the European societies was very different from the non-European societies. So the first, the idea that I would like to moving on to the second idea, moving on from the idea that the first point that I said about the post-colonial continuities. Now I take you to my second idea, which is that the patterns of inequality that we are seeing now, and which have become even more obvious in the age of migration, in the era of migration, they have traces back to history. So as academics here, we must not forget that their linkages are very much in the history that I have just pointed out. So to quote a post-colonial feminist, Gurminder Bhamra, this quotation, the economic motivation that drives poorer people to migrate has been produced and continues to be reproduced by practices emanating from richer countries and by those same countries' deficient understanding of their own global dominance. Europe's relatively high standard of living and social infrastructure have not been established or maintained separate from either the labor market and wealth of others or the creation of misery elsewhere. Thus, I would like to kind of take a pause here. I want you, all of you, to perhaps talk to the person next to you sitting. You know each other? You're friends, I'm assuming, yeah? You talk to the person next to you, look at this quotation, and maybe some of you, I don't want all of you to, some of you, which side feels more confident, you or that side? Go on, tell me, because I'm going to take both the sides later on. Which side would like to go first on this one? This is the easier one. Should I take that side? Since you're all looking, no? Okay, so what I want you to do is look at this quotation, talk to the person next to you, and tell me, give me a concrete example, either from Spain or from any other country in Europe, or even from the global south or global north. Give me an example where you think this has been happening through a concrete reality, right? So this is the theoretical point Bhamra raises, but I want you to relate it to an empirical reality. So we go with this lane, yeah? So let's say it's 4:34. Let's say I give you 5 minutes to discuss one example. You can all have different examples, but your row discusses that. Would it be possible for you to do that? And connect this to an empirical reality, what Bhamra says, the post-colonial feminist. Yeah, so have your conversation about this. You can relax. I'll come to you later on. A few minutes, or in the next hour, I will come to you. Okay, so think about the idea here about how does Bhamra, what is she talking about in terms of global dominance? How do we see it in Europe in this era of migration? Yeah. So, hi. Okay, so what, this room, all of you, what did you think about this? What did you think? What examples did you come up with? So let me kind of break it down for you. So the first idea here is that, of course, there is something that is, besides war and persecution, that is forcing people to cross the borders. But that could be something that the first world or the global north could be a cause and consequences of the global north's practices. And then, of course, the second idea here is, but the global north is completely oblivious, does not want to acknowledge that they could have had a role in the, let's say, what is called the refugee crisis, what is called the crisis of migration, right? But they want to preserve their relatively higher standards of infrastructure, living, that should not be touched by what is happening around. But of course, the Bhamra asks, can the wealth in the north be separated from what they have been doing historically? So now, over to you. What examples did you come up with? Anything, come on, you should just talk. You should not be shy, yeah?
We talked about slavery.
Yeah?
Sailing to Africa and getting slaves, going to other places, India, and bringing back the good stuff to the European countries.
Yeah, and that was the enhancing the European wealth, right? Yes?
We talked about different resources like copper, that's like right now being extracted from Zambia and processed in different places in Sweden. And they're getting very rich because of the copper that they take out in Zambia, but the workers' conditions in Zambia on the copper belt area are terrible. And also, we talked about, like, for example, she was telling me about all the cheap wood that can be sold in IKEA that comes from the Amazonas. Different examples of resources.
And somebody out here also was talking about child labor, yeah, outsourcing child labor. You know, your Nike shirts, your Nike shoes. Yeah, more examples. The back row. Any examples of this? Yeah.
I don't know if it's correct, but we thought about the fact that in some places, like for example, Palestine and Syria, with the colonization, and then when the colonizing powers left, they left really complex and confused situation for the people there to handle. And this caused also migration in the sense that the situation caused civil wars and these kind of problems, and then people had to migrate to other places.
Yeah, absolutely, yes. Thank you so much. That was great. That is what I was trying to get at also. And if you were to just kind of just on the last example, if you were to just kind of go back to what Trump, the countries where he kind of said, particularly the migration he bans or the entry he bans from, are exactly the countries where a lot of American interference and a lot of American political stratagem has been placed. So they don't want now to take responsibility, and they don't want to know these places either. Okay, so the third kind of idea that I would like to say in relation to this is that I am not denying that the current scholarship on gender and globalization, they have advanced our understanding. They have contributed. As I introduced, you know, we are able to rethink about gender and global processes in a different way than we were previously. But I think that something that is still missing in the gender and globalization literature is precisely where I started, that we are still not looking back into the colonial or let's say the post-colonial continuities and discontinuities in the field of gender and globalization. The second, and I think that here the idea that I want to connect with this is that if, for example, the theorization that we are doing about the other, the construction of the other in relation to these post-colonial discontinuities. This is, by the way, just a book. Have you ever read this book? Are you aware of this? Polish journalist. It's a very small book. I would really encourage. It's wonderful. He died a couple of years ago, but this is a very different perspective on the other debate that we see so much. So now, kind of sort of moving on, I'll take the next sort of incident that all of you, as you must be aware, has been now currently being debated hotly and heatedly in the media, and that was around the Australian National Day. That was, again, something happened recently, 26 January. And here what you're seeing is that the National Day, of course, commemorates Australia's kind of, the visibility of Australia for 230 years. But what became very important, and this connects back to where I started with Will's memoir, is the fact that the Scott Morrison, he actually made this public statement against these protests, and he said, it was 60,000 years of indigenous history, and before that, and modern, please see the choice of words, modern Australia effectively started on that day. So what he said was, in response to no pride in genocide, he said, well, I'm acknowledging that the indigenous people history was there, but of course modern Australia, is on 26th of January, so we will continue. But of course the indigenous people who protested against this said that instead of the National Day, it should be called, quote unquote, the Invasion Day. And this kind of argument about the invasion, the idea of invasion, the intruder, the stranger, the other, as Kapelowski also would say, is very dominant in this era of globalization. And even though it is bringing cohesivity, acts such as this brings cohesivity to certain groups, but it is also breaking apart other groups, and that is also something that you have to be careful about. So what would you say would be the links between the narratives, the narrative of the National Day, the protest against this, and the migration crisis in Europe? The idea here is that I would like to propose to you, and you may not agree with me, is that these protests, what they were doing actually was, in a way, forcing white Australians. But also, this is not just confined to Australia. You can bring it very much closer to home, which is also about Europe, as Bhamra would relate it more to Europe, is about reflecting about what I would call colonial amnesia. You forget about what has been happening, but also to acknowledge what some post-colonial feminists will call, quote unquote, the inconvenient truths. So this is an incident which happened in Australia, but of course there are many instances closer to home that we can talk about. Both the idea of colonial amnesia, but also the idea about inconvenient truths. And instead of silencing alternative realities, in sense of silencing alternative histories and alternative reimaginings, what we are seeing is that the resurgence of these debates are actually pointing in this direction. So my question to you is, the hope with which we started addressing the field of gender and globalization, can we do that if these alternative histories, if these alternative imaginations and these alternative realities are being submerged, are being crushed through acts of amnesia. That is something that I want you to think about. Okay? Instead, what we are seeing is, we are seeing new debates which are bringing in notions of belonging and unbelonging, insider, outsider, inclusion and exclusion. Do you all agree with me? So try to rethink about gender and globalization and the positive connotations that were supposed to imply. It was supposed to stretch our imaginations. But when you relate those largely theoretical debates with empirical realities, could you actually say that gender and globalization has given us the right kind of tools to understand the current reality? I would say, not really. Okay? Now, an example. I asked you for an example, but now I'm going to give you an example. You see many political discourses around us that make us rethink how we actually set the stage of gender and globalization in the development discourse. Now, Philip Hammond, the former secretary, he actually was criticized. He was heavily criticized by even Amnesty International went public against him. I mean, a foreign secretary holding important political positions. He talked about migrants marauding. Marauding is like running, mindless, haywire in England. And he says that this pretty, look at the choice of word, pretty desperate migrants marauding around the area will be a threat to tunnel security. And then, of course, he did not stop there. He even went off to say that Europe cannot protect itself and preserve its standard of living and social structure if it has to absorb millions of migrants from Africa, which takes me back to exactly, I will take you now back to the slide by Fabra. Can you now relate this more to what she said? That she says that the country's deficient understanding of their own global dominance, Europe's relatively high standard of living, exactly what Philip Hammond is talking about, has not been established, maintained separate from either the labor market and wealth of others. And this is exactly what Philip Hammond is referring to, that our standard of living, our social structure is all under threat because of the migration crisis. Now comes my second question to this room. And now this is going to be a little bit about your engagement with politics. This is something that, coming from a political science department, is very imperative. Now, I would like you to tell me, if I just brought you one example of Philip Hammond, can you think about another political identity anywhere across Europe, across the globe, who made similar or parallel examples about migrants? But it has to be a political identity whose voice matters in making the political discourse. You see, if I was to go and say something anti-migrants, of course, people would just say she's crazy. But you know, when it enters into political discourse, it has a separate connotation. So I want you to now take just 3-4 minutes to think about another political figure who made parallel comments about this, so that we move outside UK and look at what other countries were saying. What have you heard from other political discourses in Europe? Was this a difficult one? No. Yes?
So this was the French President Macron.
Yeah?
2017.
Yeah?
2017. And the walking asylum seeker went to, where he was obviously just going through a crowd, talking to people. And he told her, if you're not in danger, you should go back to your country. I cannot give French papers to everyone, otherwise how do I deal with all the people who are already here who cannot find work? So it's basically saying, if there's not a war or there's not a conflict in your country, you should not come to Europe and you should just stay in Morocco. Even though she had family there, she said, well, you can come visit them regularly. You don't have to be in the country, you can just get a flight out every month and visit your family. So yeah, that's one one.
Yeah, very good. Thank you. Any more? So we have France now. Yes?
I'm from the Netherlands and there's a populistic politician
Yes.
there. And I think it was 2 years ago at one party meeting they were chanting for less Moroccan, there's a lot of Moroccan immigrants in the Netherlands and they were really chanting less of them. And it was like on television everywhere.
Yeah. Yes, I heard about this one. Thank you. And more? Yeah?
I'm from Italy, actually,
Yes.
which is unfortunately the Minister of the Interior of Italy now, and based like his entire propaganda on talking about migrants and how they deal with property finance.
Yeah.
And so I think it's like this most explicit example in Europe right now because it's also like has the power to do that.
Very good, thank you. And more? Some more examples? Those at the back. Anybody in the back row? All of you are looking down in the computers. It's exactly what happens in my classes in Sweden. Everybody, as soon as I ask, looks into their computers. The back row, anybody? No? Okay, no problem. So this was really good. The three examples that we had, and of course you could say. You have heard, for example, Merkel in Germany saying waves, quote unquote, waves of migrants, kind of to take you on a slightly different tangent. When the feminists, the white feminists, when they were kind of writing about the history of feminism, they also talked about waves of feminism. And of course, this whole idea about waves is so problematized now in the feminist discourse. In the same way, this idea about waves, that they are coming and then it stops and then another wave comes, just pretty much like the first, second, third waves of feminism. And then, of course, Berlusconi, of course, said that, this is a human tsunami, quote unquote. And, these kind of, this idea about casting shame, not only about othering, but also about casting shame is that about how are we going to absorb these millions of migrants has been problematic. Now I'm going to kind of take you on I'm going to sort of connect this to something that Bauman, are you all familiar with, have you read this book, Wasted Lives? Who was from Netherlands? Yeah, okay. Now the question comes to you. So, it's an easy one. You'll probably get. So Bauman, in his book Wasted Lives, he of course, said that, in this era of gender and globalization, he didn't use gender, he's not very gender person, but globalization, he was talking about globalizing processes, the good things that happen, the interconnectivity, work, labor. But then, of course, as you can see, the subtitle of his book, Modernity and Its Outcasts, and he actually talks about this particular pattern between the North and the South. And he was talking in terms, in relation to Paul Ehrlich's book, which was published in 1968, called The Population Bomb, in which Paul Ehrlich, Paul Ehrlich? Yes? No? No? Okay, so Paul Ehrlich was actually a scientist who got many awards he was a scientist based in Stanford University, and he was the one who triggered this whole idea about overpopulation in the South. And, he was lauded by the US as the best scientist for writing this population bomb. And interestingly, me coming from India, he actually based his book on India with just one visit to India, whereby his taxi in which he was traveling with his wife was sort of thronged by slum children. And he said, oh my God, this is an overpopulated country. And he writes in his preface that what inspired him to write about overpopulation was this incident when he was trying to get back to his hotel room. Now, the irony is he went to study population, but he was actually also in a hotel room. Which is something that we are all guilty of, doing development studies, but actually we live in, or we understand development through the walls and windows of hotels. So Bauman talks about, he actually turns this debate and he says, what are you all the time talking about population and overcrowding in the South? Take Netherlands. And he says, Netherlands, you cannot have a more congested and overcrowded city like Netherlands. Is that right? Yeah? But he says, why doesn't Netherlands enter into the population theory? Why doesn't somebody say, my God, look at Europe, it is so overpopulated. We need to have population checks here. We need to have sterility camps, set up to make these men and women infertile, as you have in India, for example, or in China, for their sake. But then, of course, he said, no. Netherlands is what he calls the high entropy centers, i.e., that they're able to feed the population. So how is overpopulation judged if you're starving, if you're not able to feed, if you don't have the resources? Netherlands' high entropy centers is not in the population discourse because it extracts all the resources, wheat, meat, from other countries, from the global south, to feed its population. So it can never be seen as nobody can be seen. But yes, what is missed out is where is that extraction, the belt of extraction from the global south, nobody talks about. All they talk about is that they are very, very well enriched and very organized society. Am I right? Here. So, read this book, Wasted Life. It gives you a different perspective about globalization. But then, of course, using this idea, I'm coming to another interesting idea related to Bauman. I'm not a Bauman fan, but just like it happens that Bauman wrote things that are so relevant today. Also, now, I would like to move on to the next point here. But before I move on, I want you to. If there is a board here, there's no board to write, right? Okay, so my next question to you is that, what I want you to also think about is that we are kind of so much engrossed in the migration debate. But actually, it's not a new debate at all. Now, a very radical feminist, but also a political scientist, Susan George. All of you? No? Have not heard. Now, Susan George wrote a book in 1992 called The Debt Boomerang. And I still remember I had just kind of taken up my first position at the London School of Economics after having finished my doctoral studies. And this book was out, and everybody was like, my God, what a book, They were not taking it seriously. And in the debt boomerang, Susan George lists 7 ways that the debt from the global south is going to hit back on the West. And 2 of that, nearly all of them are correct, but 2 of them could not be even more correct. 1, she said, is the drug trade. And the second, she said, was immigration pressure. 1992. And her book was dismissed. People didn't even want to read. They thought that she had just made it up. But that's what she argued. She said that what we are seeing now, what is happening in the global south, what the north does to the global south, it is going to have repercussions. And of course, she also mentioned war and conflict. So migrants coming because of persecution, because of war and conflict is not far. These were the 3 things out of the 7 pressures, she said, that the North, particularly Europe, she said, is going to face. Out of these 3 we are seeing today. So these are not new debates. What are we talking about, the migration crisis? It was there in the 1990s, very much there. It just did not have the trigger point. It needs a trigger point for things to happen. So this is also something that I would like to end the first part of this lecture by saying that what we are actually studying is not something really new about the crisis in migration. Okay, so I will also like to give you a 10-minute break because I think it becomes a little bit heavy. But before I give you a break, would you like a 10-minute break to grab a coffee, to take some fresh air, and then we come back? Perfect. So before I end that, I would like to I want you to think about another thing that we are forgetting when we are referring to processes of globalization. Out of, let's say, if we just hone in on migration, what we are forgetting is the politics of fear. Okay, and here the starting point is that if we want to understand fear, then Europe has to step down from its moral high ground. Europe has to step down from this idea about colonial amnesia and to actually acknowledge what is happening here. But the politics of fear is very much related with this idea about not being able to step down from the moral high ground. And Bauman, again, in his book, Liquid Fear, talks. Bauman is a sociologist. He's not a political scientist. And here he says, which is very much related to our discussion in the first half of the lecture, it is the name you give to uncertainty. I don't know who my next door neighbor is, so I fear that person. Not necessarily I hate him or her, to the ignorance of the threat and what is to be done. And that's where the ideas, where the political discourse that I wanted you to, waves of migrants, human tsunami, marauding migrants. This is what it causes the uncertainty. To some word is missing. To stop, it should be stop it in its tracks, or to fight it back if stopping it's beyond our power. Stopping it is beyond, this is a misspelling there. Now here, I would like to also want you to think about, before we take the break, is that what we are talking about is not just a political reality, but it is being circulated and being counter-circulated in the imagination. So these imaginaries that we have of what Revaux in his book, The Other, says, how the other is constructed, is very much related to the idea of moral panics and fear. Now, moral panics is something that is not just something that we can relate to now. Moral panics, people have been writing, people like Stuart Hall, they have been writing about mugging scares of blacks in the UK. Moral panics came from there. But it's about how the sovereignty of the nation is under threat, that's when a moral panic becomes effective, or our identity as a nation is under threat, or as Philip Hammond was saying, our resources are going to be stretched. So there are many ideas tied to the idea of liquid fear and to moral panic. But of course, if all of you have read Stanley Cohen's work, which is classic about the construction of folk devils. So the migrants now are the new folk devils. And Stanley Cohen was talking about this idea that when you relate to a certain group of people as the folk devils, then it is easier to dehumanize them, and it is easier to dispose them. So the idea of dispensability of life, disposability of life is very much related to the idea of moral panic and the construction of folk devils. Okay, and of course, then if I was to relate this to a psychosocial literature, then of course you can also say how this spirals into an amplification of fear, and then the idea here is not very much dissimilar to what Hannah Arendt says, that we can easily erase these populations from the surface of life, because they are destroying our everydayness. They're destroying our moral codes. So scapegoat these communities, make them indispensable, make them dispensable, dehumanize them, and then wipe them out. Pretty much. In terms of both social and spatial exclusion. Okay, so I stop my first half here. I give you a 10-minute break. Should we say that we come back here at 7:20? It's just going to be 10 minutes past 5, yeah? 15:20, 5:20, sorry. 17:20, we come back here, yeah? Okay, so I'll see you soon. Sorry, which one?
Repeat the name of the guy who said about the population bomb.
Paul Ehrlich. So I will just let me do a search for you.
Because
it's a very small book, but extremely controversial. So.
Because the version I know was with Rockefeller, one of the Rockefeller
yes.
brothers and da. Because I've been working quite a lot about this kind of question of population, and obviously migration.
Ahora cuando adecuaron un descansito, un descansito entre medio, ¿no? No, ahora quiere seguir, lo que quiere decir. Sí, pero ella termina a las 6
I like quite a lot the way you try
to get them going.
Yeah. I think it's quite good.
Thanks. Yeah, why doesn't it? See if you can do a search. Paul Ehrlich.
He was, what was he?
He was an environmental scientist.
Yes.
Why doesn't it problem
Because I
loading
have
page?
a small piece about population bomb and stuff. It's part of the.
Ya te paso el link y te paso también la dirección. Nosotros estamos aquí. Solo tienes que seguir recto y en la esquinita es el de...
The language you read are English and.
Yes.
What is your mother language?
It's Hindi, but we are bilingual Indians, so we are English and Hindi speakers. Here, Paul Elric. Here.
Ahora estamos justo al lado.
The population bomb, 1968. This one. This is the book I was referring to.
It seemed to me, no, that's true. It's because the first international population meeting is 72.
Yeah. Yes.
And in this one,
exactly.
the southern countries say, "Fuck off, we will
Yeah.
never reduce
Yes,
our population."
yeah, exactly.
I teach this, and Bush father was the U.S. representative in the UNO.
Yeah.
And he said,
Yes,
now
exactly.
population question cannot be a personal question, it's going to be the states. And
Yes. And you know, one of the meetings took place in India, and the feminists had told them to get lost, you know? Yeah.
I wanted to tell you guys I started to see a show yesterday.
Yeah.
And it's on Netflix. It's called Black Earth Rising. I don't know if you've heard of it.
No black?
It's Black Earth Rising. And it's about the Rwandan genocide.
I've seen so many movies on the Rwandan genocide.
I'm like fascinated about it because I think it's so interesting. And it's Rwanda.
On the Rwandan genocide.
And it starts with something similar because when you were talking about it, I noticed it started with something similar, and it's like a woman that works for the International Criminal Court.
Yeah.
And
What did you say? Black?
Black Earth Rising.
Yeah.
I just saw an episode, so I don't know how good
Wow.
it is. But it's kind of talks about that as well because the woman was giving like a speech, and then the guy who was from Rwanda, he was like, how does Europe feel in the role to solve problems that they cause themselves?
Yes,
you know?
yes.
And then there's her daughter is from Rwanda, and she was
Yeah.
a migrant because she survived the genocide.
Yeah.
So it's this entire like conflict between like helping, but also is it your place to help when you tried to help in the past and you caused all of this?
Yeah, and they ran away, the UN, right?
Yeah.
I need
It's very interesting.
your sign here.
So this is?
This is the honoraries.
Okay. So this, here.
Yes. Wow, that's very nice. No, it's like a professional one. Perfect.
So,
Thank you.
73, George Bush,
Yeah.
representative of the United States for UNO, said today we cannot say that the problem of a growing population is a private question. It needs a special attention from national and international leaders. First conference, International Bucharest, 74. Then first conference about women
Yeah.
in Mexico, and then everything. This is, and first McNamara was in the Vietnam War, and it was before the Ford, and this is this is.
Oh, I'm excited that you.
This is one of my.
Fantastic.
Because Consejo Nacional, National Population Council, created by referendum 50, one of the first and presenting overpopulation as a threat for development. Then 62 ONU says it's number one world problem. Then 69 McNamara as president of World Bank says we can centralize the population politics of the UNO, so creating FNUAP, this one,
Okay.
So, this is in my first book about globalization.
Okay, good.
Well, I have it in French and Spanish, but in English.
Not in English.
Sorry. but yeah, this is a very, because when Beijing happened, I was in El Salvador, Central America, and we were like opposing to Beijing, criticizing, and I said I should do a small investigation about the question of abortion, anti-contraceptive, and this led me to this. I said, wow, and all what is funded by the IMF, all what is funded by the US corporation, the US aid, everything about contraception, everything. Testing, producing the results, translating to different languages, spreading, then also incentivizing different countries to build demographic unities. Then they give the programs and the computers for demographics. Then they control almost everything. The only thing that they don't do is producing and eating. All the rest they do, also the general orders. Then the transportation, stock. I mean, it's amazing. This is also in this text. But I was, and all the investigation, they're funding, and they're funding the spreading of the results. I mean, it's so crazy. And obviously what they look for is cheap and long-term and no control for women, and then the experiments they do it on poor women, illiterate women, black women, indigenous women.
The Depo-Provera and all that.
That's it. And for Central and Latin America, transportation and stock is a stuff called Matrix International. It's great.
Okay. So, welcome back. And I'll continue from where I left. And now I will take you into, so we keep this flow of gender and globalization. And we now look at another feature, but another aspect. So from moving on from marauding migrants, we haven't really left migrants as yet, but we're going to look at another phenomena, and that has to do with the US zero tolerance policy. Are you all aware of the zero, which has largely to do with the prosecution of undocumented migrants. But it's not so much the undocumented migrants and what's happening, because there we can have parallels in Europe. But it is another feature which I have been researching on, or have just started researching on. It's a very difficult subject because the records are very difficult to access. And this is around the idea which I would like to call, or which has been called policing. Police as to the police, but it's called policing ethnicity. And what does policing ethnicity means? Policing ethnicity means, or what I mean by policing ethnicity, is that how certain ethnic populations are created as a source of insecurity. You know, pretty much around the debates of the other, but here we are talking about insecurity and instability. So both the ideas are juxtaposed to each other. And when you have this discourse of both insecurity and instability, then of course it becomes very easy to control the borders. That's exactly on the zero tolerance policy in the US. And of course it facilitates other practices such as stop and search and ethnic profiling, which has become disconcertingly very common even in so-called places which have prided themselves in a lack of colonial past, such as Sweden. Now, in the zero tolerance policy, the aspect that I would like to talk about is what happens when you cannot prosecute people, and here we are talking about children. So the law says that you cannot prosecute these children who are crossing the Mexican-US border along with their parents. So what we have seen is that the children have been forcibly taken away. Are you all aware of this? It was a lot in the reports, in the media. The children have been taken away, leading to what NGOs would call as family separations. Okay. Now, this is also related to an idea which I would say is missing in the gender and globalization debates, the idea of vulnerability. Gender and globalization has talked a lot about exploitation. It has talked a lot about gender exploitation. It has talked a lot about gendered violence. But the gender in the gender and globalization debates still somehow remains or skirts around the vulnerability of women. But my talk today was also, and what we are discussing now in terms of the zero tolerance policy, also talks about the victimhood of men, the vulnerability of men. If we do not acknowledge the vulnerability of men in these discourses, then I don't think we are doing really gender. I think we are doing women's studies then. And that conflation still continues despite all the kind of progress we have made in our ways of thinking and disaggregating gender. So what I want to point out here with this example is that since spring 2018, what we have seen is, I have the number here, we have seen more than 11,000 children which have been taken away forcibly from their parents and placed in what has been called, quote unquote, tender age shelters. And what are these tender age shelters? These are basically government shelters which are managed by Department of Health and Human Services. But the idea here is that even though all this has provoked international outrage, and there have been organizations such as the Bethany Christian Services who have said that we would place these children in foster families, but even placing these children in foster families raises a new set of questions. These are white adoptive parents we are talking about. And these are Mexican children. So going back to the idea of policing ethnicity and what it does, It manages people. It manages people's lives. But in this case, it's children. You're placing these non-European children into white adoptive children under the argument that these would make, quote unquote, it has been said in the discourse, better families. So, in other words, what you're saying is you're limiting the ability of non-white families to parent. So this is another discourse related to migration and the breach of what is seen as breach of migration. So what I would like you to think about is that even though the zero, again going back to where I started, that if you have to understand gender and globalization within the framework of coloniality of gender and coloniality of power, then we have to also understand this case study about US zero tolerance policy in terms of how is it related to earlier examples of forced separations. A very good movie to see here is by Ken Loach, The Rabbit-Proof Fence. Anybody of you has seen, which is about Aboriginal children taken away and placed in foster homes in Australia, but also in other parts of the world. You had boarding schools for Native communities, and the examples of the First Nations in Canada is a very good example. You had something called the orphan trains for children from Catholic and Jewish families, and this whole pathologization of the African American families. So this idea about placing these Mexican children with white adoptive parents, questioning the ability of Mexican families to parent their own children themselves, has roots in the colonial past, has roots in the coloniality of past. So again, coming back to what Cujano said, that modernity and coloniality are two sides of the same coin. Yeah, modernity is the underbelly of coloniality. And again, you can relate it back to what Achille Mbembe said in his article on necropolitics. Again, I want to get a sense. Anybody familiar with the idea of necropolitics? So necropolitics is kind of his idea, Mbembe's idea. It's kind of it's a little bit I would say difficult to understand in the beginning, but the idea is about related to the dispensability and disposability of the bodies. And Mbembe develops on Fanon's book, Wretched of the Earth, to basically argue that these expressions of sovereign power, stop, search, ethnic profiling, take away the children, these expressions of sovereign power over the body, whether you detain the body, you beat the body, you conduct violence on the body, these emerged during the time of colonialism, but have expanded and metamorphosed into various different forms, such as border controls, surveillance, and racial hierarchies in immigration regimes. So this idea about necropolitics is related very much to the idea of death and violence on the body. And also to make us think slightly differently about when we are talking about migrant bodies, we are talking about how migrant bodies can become nexus points for other kinds of spatial practices, right? So we have to think about it also slightly in geographical terms, not in any kind of sort of confined unilinear way. And the exclusion of this migrant body is very much part of the public imaginary. It is seen to be out of place, out of time. When something is constructed out of place, out of time, you can dispose it, you can destroy it, you can kill it. So what we are seeing, the acts of violence on these bodies is related to the imaginary. How do we imagine these bodies? And that's where people like Mbembe becomes very, very important around issues of security and survival. But also, if you were to connect them to other concrete examples, such as the crossing overs on the Mediterranean borders, Lampedusa, the deaths at Lampedusa, all these ideas you can connect with the idea of the biopolitics, the biopower, the power of the state and the sovereignty that is often threatened. And who gets defined as an outsider, who gets defined as an alien, and who gets defined as a non-resident. These are categories that we are very much addressing right now. Okay, and so finally, I move to the last example that I would give to you, which is another kind of migration. So we have looked at our migration, whereby we are seeing refugees and migrants, largely refugees, war-torn, escaping through other means, coming into Europe. We've seen a second kind of migration, which is more about borders, which is more about crossing the borders to work and it doesn't really have to do with persecution and war, which is the US zero-tolerance policy. The third kind of migration that I would say, which involves border crossing, is pretty much what I would call, in my new research, the reproductive tourist. And the reproductive tourist is very much related to the debates that we see around transnational surrogacy, and what some people have called the entrepreneur, the repreneur, collapsing the word reproduction and entrepreneur. For example, a Danish feminist such as Kroloke have called it the repreneur, going to the global south. And by global south, I don't mean India, even though India is the largest hub of transnational surrogacy, but places like Laos, places like Nepal, but also other kinds of movements that we see of tissues, of ova, of sperms from Romania to Israel, from Israel to the US. Those are also, I would say, things to be encapsulated within migration. They're also moving across borders. But of course, the most problematic thing, which has to be acknowledged by the globalization debates, and it's also about gender disparity, is that it's the outsourcing of the reproductive labor of women in the South, who have always been, within population discourses, seen as, quote unquote, the waste. They have to be sterilized because they populate too quickly. So the same bodies which have been seen as waste in population discourses are now seen as part of the reproductive labor. But reproductive labor for whom? For wealthy couples, white wealthy couples from the north. And it is this new bioeconomy which has been created, which has given the idea of procreation, birth, a completely different new setting. And of course, it also has set up new dimensions. What is reproductive rights? The white parent says, we have, under the UN human rights, the right to have the baby, a right to life, which can be extended to the right to have a baby. But can you juxtapose that to reproductive choice, which women in the global south have? So the idea of rights and choices, rights versus choices, is also central to these debates. The kind of choices I would like to pay, while being also at the same time upwardly mobile. And it is something that the LGBTQ people, the disabled people, single parents, and other marginalized groups in the global north, they have been asserting more and more about reproductive rights. But yes, reproductive rights, and we are accessing reproductive technology, but at whose labor, at whose cost, is something that we need to think about within our scholarly discussion. I would also like to keep some time for discussion and to get your opinions, and for you to ask me questions. So I would like to end by two things which are very unacademic. And one is to bring you a quotation from Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. Anybody familiar with the author? You've read, yeah? And she said in one of her current speeches on life and borders and boundaries and migrants, she says, nobody is ever just a single thing. And yet, in the public discourse today, we often speak of people as a thing. This is about dehumanization. This is about dispensability, a thing you can throw away. you can burn, kill. Whether you're talking about a refugee, you're talking about an immigrant, let us remember that dignity is as important as food. And following on from that, I would like to read out a poem that I read, which was to encapsulate some of the feelings, some of the ideas, some of the tensions in my own mind around the debates, around these debates about dispensability and the construction of the stranger. So the poem is titled The Stranger. Restlessness in life, a runaway hope, like a stranger at crossroads. An engagement, a country of roses, cyclamens, daffodils, and cacti. Emotions buried in that nocturnal silence, I, the stranger, juxtapose with an earthly existence. Chasing the shadow of my consciousness, sleep that eludes me, wrapped around the icy storm on the glass panes, a stranger with just a heart. A buried anxiety of a virgin island, cohabitation with a defaced man, two strangers, a shared bed, fraternity or lust, amidst a runaway hope. Thank you very much.
Questions or debates? I don't know. Is the microphone? Any questions?
It couldn't have been that perfect. Come on, ask me something. Yeah, maybe you can also give your own reflections on the subject, what you have read. Maybe there's things that you didn't really like in my presentation also. Your own reflections from your own readings of things.
I wanted to let the students go first. Does this work? Yeah. So I'm not a student. Okay. I teach some of these lovely students here at the back. I'm a historian of colonial India, and I'm really interested in postcolonial and contemporary India as well, so just coming from that perspective. I have a question about how internal dynamics between countries in the global south, or how south-south interactions fit into some of the things that you have explained, and specifically with Gurminder Bhambra's quotation that you showed us, because I was thinking about immigrants from Kerala going to the Gulf countries, immigrants from Bihar and UP going to Delhi, or you know, like dynamics within the South, or South dynamics. How do they fit into the sort of very large global framework that you've told us about?
Thank you very much for that really interesting question. And I would like to say that it is a very important point that you have raised, because I think that from what you are saying is also a way of actually challenging the homogenization of the South, because there is not a homogeneous entity called the South. And in terms of these internal migrations that are taking place, of course these are very exploitative, particularly when they are work-related. But also there is a certain hierarchy between the North and the South. Let's say even if we were to talk about India. But also if you were to look at Asia, just if we keep to Asia, within the South, there is a particular perception about Nepal and Nepali women, that i.e., for example, one of the largest suppliers of the prostitution industry in India are Nepali women, right? So there are notions about dispensability of their lives. But even within India, you could say, there is also the religion and caste, which is totally, which bifurcates. So a current government of Narendra Modi, where he says, this is going to be a Hindu nation, and Hindu women are going to procreate, and produce more Hindu children. Well, where does it leave the Muslims? And what about the Muslims who have migrated, let's say, from other parts of the country to find work in, let's say, cosmopolitan cities like Delhi and Calcutta and Bombay? So I think that what I would like to say is that we no longer actually even though I was using it in my own presentation quite problematically, I don't think we can even talk about a South. Because South is no longer a homogeneous entity. There are various disparities, economic, social, based on gender, caste, and class, religion, that bifurcates the South. Some places in the South are very much like the North, exploitative. So, yeah. Did you find the lecture difficult? No?
Thank you. Thank you very much for the presentation. I just wanted to know your opinion about surrogacy and how, the role of the state, because in Mexico, it has been a debate that the new minister, there have been a lot of government changes, and there's a lot of new people in politics now, and there's this woman that's fighting a lot for women's freedom, and she's looking to make abortion legal, depenalized abortion on the whole territory, and everyone thought that was great, but then she said that, not everyone, but I thought that was great, but then she said that in order to expand women's freedom, she also wanted to legalize and to establish a system for surrogacy and for legalizing this whole buying a uterus or renting a uterus. So if you could expand your perspectives on that subject,
Sure.
would be great. Thank you.
That's also a very interesting, very topical question. I think that, kind of just from where you ended, there's this whole debate now, which is, I would say, it's very difficult to actually position yourself, and me coming from the global South, I'm myself torn, because, the whole idea about renting the womb now, which is what surrogacy, the sister name for surrogacy is that debate itself is split, because on the one hand, feminists argue that, let's say, if you were to just see it from the surrogates, and some of the interviews and oral narratives of surrogates who have said that, it allows me to buy a new house, it allows me to educate my girl child, it gives me monetary freedom from my husband. So there is that debate, that it has allowed people to get financial agency. But then, of course, there are other debates whereby certain cases, such as the Baby M case, happened, and also the controversial case in Thailand when Thai surrogates, when 2 children were born out of surrogates, but one of them had a genetic defect, and the couple took away the one the right baby and left the genetic child back in Thailand. So there are those debates which are exploitative also. So you're kind of, and then of course the government of India has now banned gay couples from accessing surrogacy in India. Indian nationals can do that, but it has to be, it cannot be commercial anymore. It has to be altruistic. And that itself sets up another set of dimensions. So for example, there is a household. And in places like India, we do have joint households, right? Sister, auntie, uncle. Now suppose, one of the female members decides that she is not able to have. So it can lead to other forms of exploitation within the household, other forms of intimidation of younger children, younger girls to act as surrogates. So altruistic surrogacy, which is now being promoted as the feminist choice, is not right either, because contexts vary. Also in places like India, but also other places like the Middle East and Thailand, where you can get domestic help. It has also been argued that sometimes the domestic help is coerced to act as a surrogate. So to answer your question is that even though the state, particularly the Indian state, most recently with the surrogacy ban, has taken steps to ensure that surrogates are not exploited, but it has not perhaps, it has not been thought through, because there are some loopholes which can trigger other forms of exploitative relationships, such as the one I was telling you within the household.
My question is more about vocabulary to see. I'm not sure if I understand it right, because you used a few times the word imaginations or imaginaries, but what's the definite, like how, I don't understand exactly what it means in this context.
In the context, okay. So it kind of, my understanding of imagination is two-front. I kind of lean towards the German theorist Stellenbosch, who has talked a lot about the role of imagination. But that was more in terms of how imagination capital. So, for example, when it has been referred to in a positive way, if you imagine change, if you're able to, and this is largely coming from the deprived households with deprived children who have no resources for education, if you can imagine change, that itself is a trigger that you're moving on. So imagination has been given the role of, it has been associated with the positive capital. But the way I was using is the other way of using imagination is how political imaginaries, which are sort of feeding the political discourse and the social discourse, which is about you imagine the other as somebody who is a threat to your security, stability, and also a threat to your own resources. Then if you imagine the other that way, the idea of dispensability and disposability becomes easier. Right, so that's how I was here. But there are two meanings to imagination. Yeah.
Okay, so this is something that I cannot really wrap my head around, so the question is going to be probably very poorly phrased, but women have always done work, they've always labored with their bodies. So in colonial India, Indian women worked as ayahs, as wet nurses, as nannies for white British families in India. There were also wet nurses in sort of early modern and modern European history. There's sex work as well, as another form of women doing work with their bodies or doing labor with their bodies. So I think I'm just trying to come to terms with why is this reproductive labor of surrogacy different? In what way is it different from... I guess what I mean to say is the work or are the debates around this sort of reproductive labor similar in any way to the debates around prostitution? Are there any commonalities or any parallels between the two?
Yeah, that is such a good question, because that's exactly what I'm kind of grappling and writing right now. There's going to be a workshop in the UK at King's College London, if some of you are interested, on exactly the topic about reproductive slavery. And the idea here is, so what I'm trying to do is, the examples that you've given, not exactly the examples of the wet nurse, but looking at the sexual liaison between colonial officers and native women. And that give rise to mixed offsprings, right? But what happened is that these mixed offsprings, of course, managed to get into the colonial administration because their father was a white man. And the women also managed to get a little bit more independence, so there were some benefits with that. So the argument here is that, but can we say that that was not still a form of colonial slavery, these sexual liaisons that took place, or even, for example, prostitution in the what was called the red block buildings during colonial India. So I think to come back to your question is that there have been forms of labor which were there in colonial India, but the question is, how do we conceptualize that labor? Do we conceptualize that labor as forms of slavery? Or do we take a more kind of nuanced approach and say, yes, there were forms of slavery, but they allowed the women some modicum of agency. In the same way, the surrogacy debates are going back and saying it is a form of reproductive slavery because you're not the genetic mother of the children, you're just the gestational mother. Or do we say that we have to also see that it gives women economic independence? So the debates are still kind of tender. They have to be nuanced.
Are the debates around surrogacy, I guess, influenced by some sort of perception that having children and motherhood is like the ultimate goal that women should have, and so it's somehow indecent or immoral or ethical to outsource that work?
Yeah. Yeah.
Which maybe doesn't happen so much with prostitution or with sex work anymore. Yeah. I don't know. Like, is there any of that?
Yes, there is debates because you see, the thing is that the few women that I have interviewed, they want to keep it silent. So, you know, when they want to be a surrogate, they'll go away from the village and they'll go and stay in the city. So nobody in the village knows why she's gone away for 9 months. You know, so there is a silence that is maintained over this, partly because motherhood is so honored. And this is not just like just a sociological discourse. This is related with the colonial history of India, when we had the image of Mother India, as much as you had the image of Mother Ireland. So, you know, the whole kind of sanctified image of Mother India sort of also feeds into this. So there is a huge amount of secrecy and privacy around surrogates. They don't want anybody to know that they are carrying somebody else's, because even though it is not, you know, there has been no sexual activity, but still the village where they come from would see them as pretty much as prostitutes. That's what they say. We don't want to be seen as prostitutes. So it's a very complicated kind of psychological analysis has to be also done on this issue. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks a lot. I don't know if I will be able to say it in English properly as I would like, but this is a very important theme in general, and it interests me quite a lot. And I don't know, you probably know the work of Kasia Ekman.
Kasia Ekman, yes.
And she's making a parallel, very interesting parallel between surrogacy and prostitution or sex work. And then I've been trying to reflect on or theorize the question of, in the 3 dimensions of sex, race, and class, how, which rules or which institution organize both union, I mean, wedding union, and descendancy, the laws of who is supposed to get married with who, or not supposed to get married at all, or everything, in base of sex, race, and class, in different periods and different places. And then, if you have children, are you allowed to have children? Do you have to have many children? What kind of children in terms of sex and race and class? And then, who the children do belong to? Because this is not obvious. It can be to the mother, to the family of the mother, to the state, to the ta-ta-ta-ta-ta. So I propose a concept which is straight bind, based on Wittig's straight mind, but this is straight bind. And I don't know exactly how it could be used, but I think it's some sort of trying to think the complexity of all this very old and historically complex situation of who is supposed to produce what kind of children, and then when the child is produced, depending on her or his sex or gender and color and legitimacy of the parents' union. This is quite complicated, and maybe you would be interested in a small remark that Cynthia Enloe made in her first book, Bananas, Beaches and Bases.
Yeah.
She talks about the children who are born from sexual relation between Asian sex workers, probably in Philippines, I don't remember right now.
Yes.
Philippines, and the US soldiers, and then depending on if the soldiers were white, black, or Latino, the situation of the children is different. But anyway, there are mixed race and of prostitute or sex worker mother. So Cynthia Enloe insists on what is the future of these children, and many of them then become sex workers. Racialized, I mean, street children, and well, this is quite.
And also
horrible.
kind of this, this debate has now filtered into the UN sexual exploitation, of native women in Congo, in Rwanda, and yeah, it's a very big kind of.
Sorry, could you repeat the name of the first author that you mentioned?
Cynthia Enloe?
No.
Oh, Kasia Ekman?
Kasia Ekman? Ekman, E-K-M-A-N.
I think so, yeah.
Thank you.
One last one.
Hi, thank you very much. So I'm not sure if I will be able to do that in English properly, but I will try my best. Okay. So what I can understand about this talk is that, or this lecture is that, this imagine of the other woman, the other migrant, as a threat for the wellness, for example, here in Europe, is this imagine of this other that makes us white people to dehumanize, dispose these people and make them like arrest.
Yeah.
So which is the alternative? Which is the opposite imagine that probably could create different reaction, like humanize these persons, make them important, so which is the alternative? It's maybe the uniqueness, or how to call this? How to say that actually we are all equal?
Yeah.
The oneness as opposite of the otherness?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I haven't thought that through, but when listening to Adichie's speech, I think that what you're saying is something that she tries to refer to, is that nobody is an it, nobody is a thing. That you need to, instead of having these kind of sort of feeding into these political imaginaries of the other, what we basically need to think about in terms of humanity. Okay, it sounds very sort of romantic at one level, but I guess there is some truth in that if you don't embark on any sort of humanizing tendencies, then of course these othering negative tendencies will predominate. And I think that there are the voices that would make you think otherwise are far and few in our society, because the political discourse is so virulent and so vicious, I would say, that that unless and until that changes, I think people will not change. Because people lean on political discourses for their imagination. You see? So, but yes, thanks for that positive note, because I think we need something to replace the negativity that we are living in. Yes.